Hello students and welcome back. This is the Fundamentals of Chemistry and I'm Professor Fernetovich. This is Chemistry for Botanists, so welcome. We left off talking about atomic structure and what an atom looks like. Sometimes pictures like this are called Bohr models that show the nucleus with the neutrons and protons and the electrons floating or rotating on the outside. Even though they don't look like they're moving, those electrons which have negative charges are in constant motion around the nucleus, which is inherently positive because of the protons. So we talked about what's inside an atom, and now we're going to talk about how atoms are represented on the periodic table. We talked a little bit about this in the part 1 video of this series. And I want to expand on that so that you know what you're looking for when you look at a periodic table and when you see chemical symbols. So what we have here on the right is what you might see in one of those boxes on a periodic table. The periodic table I showed you was a little bit different, where it just had a letter and one number. But you may see something like this. So each atom on the periodic table is represented by a unique atomic symbol. And that's the abbreviation. That's the letter or letters that represent the element. So carbon is C. Calcium, which also starts with a C, is a capital C lowercase a. So the first letter, if there are two letters, is always capitalized, and the second letter would be lowercase. You wouldn't want to have capital C, capital A, because that could be something different. Okay, and in this little area over here, we've got two numbers. The larger number, that's value-wise, not necessarily font size. Okay, the larger value number represents the mass number of that element. What's a mass number? That's the count of protons plus the count of neutrons in the nucleus. So carbon, if we add up protons and neutrons in the nucleus, we've got 12. Okay. And that's with the weight of the atom. So a proton weighs 1 atomic mass unit and a neutron weighs 1 atomic mass unit. So when we add all those up, we have 12 atomic mass units in the nucleus. The smaller number, and that smaller value, the 6 over in that corner, is the atomic number. Okay. And the atomic number is a number that never changes for an element. That is the number of protons in the nucleus. So carbon always has 6 protons in the nucleus, okay? And that contributes 6 atomic mass units to the mass number. But the number of neutrons can vary depending on whether we're looking at different isotopes of carbon. The most common isotope of carbon is carbon-12, which is shown and represented here. It has 12 mass units with 6 protons, and that would mean that we also have 6 neutrons, because 6 plus 6 equals 12. But another isotope that's relatively common, it's less common than 12, is carbon-13. And in that sense, we have the same atomic number. Carbon's atomic number never changes, but this number would be 13. And that would say to us that there are 7 neutrons in the nucleus. So we would have 6 protons with 6 atomic mass units, 7 neutrons with 7 atomic mass units, add them up to 13. And likewise, there's carbon-14, and you can guess what that's all about. The atomic number for carbon-14 is still 6, but instead of 6 or 7 neutrons, there's 8. So we have a bigger mass. It's a heavier form of carbon. And so these different isotopes are just naturally present all around us, and they will change forms. They give off radioactivity, and they're just different forms of the element that we have. So we're going to talk about these elements, but more often in botany and science, we talk about molecules, which is 2 or more atoms bonded together. So Yeah, carbon is very interesting, but we usually see it in the form of carbon dioxide or glucose or starches. So that's where we're going with this. Two or more atoms bonded together makes a molecule. So we have some molecules that have the same atoms, the same elements in them. So O2, this is a molecule that's made of oxygen. I know that from the periodic table that O is the atomic symbol for oxygen. This little 2 that hangs off the end of it, we're not talking about what's in the periodic table box anymore. We're outside of the box. This says that we have 2 atoms of oxygen. Okay, they're bonded together. There's oxygen, oxygen, O2. Same with the hydrogen. We've got a hydrogen, hydrogen, H2. Nitrogen, 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 N2. And those are some common forms of those elements that we find that bonded together. Those are called elemental molecules, where it's just the same element. Compounds are what we have in the second line, and they are made of 2 or more different elements. So carbon and oxygen, hydrogen and oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay, so here we have a carbon, and there in CO2, there's just 1 carbon bonded to 2 oxygens. So the little 2 that hangs down is only referring to the element in front of it. If there is just 1 of an element in a molecule, they don't write the 1. Just for simplicity, that C represents the 1. I don't know why. It's just how chemistry is. So in water, H2O, we have 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 atom of oxygen. In C6H12O6, do you know what that is? That's glucose. We have 6 atoms of carbon, 12 atoms of hydrogen, and 6 atoms of oxygen bonded together. So this is a relatively larger molecule with 24 total atoms of it, 3 different elements combined. Okay, so it's a little bit larger than water and carbon dioxide. So it's bonds that bring these atoms together. Bonds between atoms are actually caused by the electrons in the outermost shells. So the process of bond formation is called a reaction. To get carbon and oxygen, those 2 oxygens to bond together, we need a chemical reaction. To break it apart, that requires another chemical reaction. And we will be seeing 4 major types of bonds formed by chemical reactions. So when we bring things together, what types of bonds there are? We have polar covalent bonds. Okay, covalent means that there is sharing of electrons. And you'll see polar covalent and non-polar covalent. Okay. Both involve sharing of the electrons. Non-polar covalent occurs when we have equal sharing of electrons. So imagine we have these 2 atoms and electrons are circulating evenly between the 2. Okay, equal sharing. That means there's no polarity in this molecule. There's no negative side and positive side. Polarity refers to positive and negative in chemistry. Okay. Polar covalent is when we have 2, or we could be talking, 2, we'll keep it simple, 2 atoms, and the electron is being shared between the 2, but it's spending more time around one atom than the other. So the electron is hanging out over here more than over here. It's just a little bit of time. So because the electron is negatively charged, that makes this part of the molecule slightly negative. And over here, since the electron's not there so much, slightly positive. So now we have polarity in our molecule. Water is an example of a polar molecule. And it's an example where there are 3 atoms in the molecule, H2, 2 H's, and an O. The oxygen in H2O is electronegative, and that means it attracts the electron. So the electron of water that's being shared is spending a lot of time over around the oxygen and not much time near the hydrogens. So the hydrogens end up being slightly positive and the oxygen is slightly negative. It's polar, it's got that polarity. And now that helps it stick to other water molecules because that negative oxygen can stick to the positive hydrogens of a neighboring water molecule. Okay, and that can stick to a neighboring water molecule. And we have between these water molecules these weak attractions called hydrogen bonds. So that's that fourth type of bond that's in here. Okay, it's not always formed with water, but that's the most common example we have in biology. We also see hydrogen bonding as important in DNA. Okay, it helps bond our genetic information. It's a pretty weak bond caused by those charges. Okay, so covalent, two different types of sharing, electron sharing. Ionic bonding is fairly different, and we don't see it so much in biomolecules. It's when we have an exchange of electrons. Okay? We have a molecule that has an electron. This molecule needs an electron, and it will donate the electron. This causes a difference in charge now because we have the complete exchange of electrons. Now we have one that's positive, one that's negative, and they bond together. Sodium chloride, that molecule I talked about in part 1 of this series, is an ionic molecule. It's caused by ion distribution. So sodium becomes a positive ion, it loses an electron. Chlorine becomes a negative ion, gains the electron, and they stick together. This is what sodium chloride looks like up close. Okay, we have these big chlorines and these little sodiums, and under a microscope, we would see it looking like this. Actually, salt looks very different under a microscope depending on how it's produced. Sea salt looks different than flaky salt, and kosher salt looks different than iodized salt. So this is just one example. It's actually pretty cool if you have a microscope around, check out different types of salt. And this picture is showing water, and these are different ways to represent a water molecule. You'll notice we have one oxygen next to two hydrogens, and we have little blue electrons here. So hydrogen has one proton and one electron. Okay, it's right here. Oxygen has 6 electrons in its outer shell. And so it's sharing one of its electrons with hydrogen here, another one with hydrogen here, and this hydrogen is sharing its own electron with oxygen here, and same with this one. Okay, so this is showing how we have a complex molecule. We've got a lot of sharing going on between these 3 atoms, and it's holding this molecule together. This is a ball and stick model that we sometimes see in chemistry. Oxygen, hydrogen, the bond is just represented by this little stick. And because hydrogens kind of repel each other to some extent, we have always a certain angle to the bonds of hydrogen. This model over here is showing the slight charges. This little symbol here is the Greek symbol for sigma, and it means slight. The oxygen has a slight negative charge. The hydrogens have a slight positive charge because of the unequal sharing of electrons. Now, this is what water looks like when we get many of them together. And here is that space-filling model right here showing the sigmas, positives and negatives, and many other water molecules. So here's a water molecule, here's a water molecule, and the dotted lines are representing the hydrogen bonds between different water molecules. And you might be thinking, didn't she say water was polar? Well, it is. Within the water molecule, hydrogen and oxygen are bonded with polar covalent bonds. But between different water molecules, The slight negative charge and slight positive charge cause the hydrogen bonds. So here we would see two different bonds.